The name of this workshop is Design Research, the Secret Weapon in the Fight for Customers. It's all really about understanding the mindset and the approach of design research. So you won't necessarily come away with very particular skills, but we will hopefully come away with an understanding of how design research works in projects where it uses it as a really powerful tool in developing new products or services and helping to understand customers and companies themselves. So just a bit about us as a company and what's happening with us. The whole point of this workshop and the reason we organised it is because we are now rebranding from Fowlam to Nightingale. So we started as Fowlam in 2016. Michael and I set up the company together. There's Michael next to me. And Jo also works with us, and you've seen Jo on the camera. She's our project manager. We're rebranding because we started as a user research consultancy back in 2016, and we started delivering user research to a range of companies. But over the years, what we have found is that what we really deliver to companies and organizations is not just user research. I mean, user research is really powerful, it's a great tool, but what we found is that it's actually expanded quite a bit beyond that. User research tends to be about just understanding your users, their opinions, their needs, how they work, what they do. What we end up doing a lot of the time with organizations that we work with is much more complex than that. What we found is that when research really gets embedded into a company or an organization, it becomes a really powerful tool that they use in every aspect of what they do. So it's not just about understanding users, it's about understanding the company themselves, what the goal of the company is, how to use their team to the best advantage. And companies that really get the bug of research start wanting to have research in every aspect of their company. So we've done research with teams, we've done research on business models, we've done research on such a wide range of things that it's gone way, way beyond the user research side of things. So we've chosen the name Nightingale for Florence Nightingale, and today is her 200th anniversary of her birth. Florence Nightingale is an icon for us, I suppose, because she used data, evidence, understanding of a situation in order to change the situation, and that's how we work. It's all about using evidence to make decisions. And you can see our logo, it's about shining a light. I mean, she was famous as the Lady of the Lamp. And it's about really understanding every aspect of your business in order to make decisions that have the greatest chance of success for your business. I introduced our team, so there we are. We're a very small team, but we work with a very wide range of contractors and freelancers. We work with people who we think are great, basically, and that gives us great flexibility to deliver things to companies. Just an idea of who we work with. As you can see, it's a very wide range of companies, and I suppose this illustrates how things have changed for us over the years, because we have ended up with such a broad range of organizations, and it has fed into, our research has fed into such a wide range of things. So obviously with Lego, the research we have done is with children and how they play. For the pensions regulator, it's about how to convey information to people about pensions. Health Education England is about the training of doctors. So it's been a very wide range of things, and research has made a difference in all of these different areas. And this is our tagline, and this is what we say when we're delivering research to people. It's about practical insight for a competitive advantage. And the practical element is the really important part. And what we find too often really is that research is done as a sort of a sideline. It's an extra, it's put in a drawer because no one really needs to use it or wants to use it. When we're doing research, it's about what difference can this research make? What decision is this research informing? How can a piece of research here, a piece of evidence really make a difference in this project? And for commercial companies, it's a bit different in government departments, of course, but for commercial companies, it's about a competitive advantage. How will this make a difference in a practical way to your product that would put you ahead of the competition? What is it that your competitors are not doing that you could do that it could improve your position in the market? So it's very kind of tailored to making a decision. So the purpose of design research, as we see it, and this is how it has developed for us over the last few years and how it's ended up working in the organizations that we work with, Firstly and foremostly, I think it challenges the team to clearly and thoroughly identify and define their goals before a project starts, so that the project has a clear direction. And I'll go into this in a lot more detail in a minute, because I feel like this is where the real value happens with research. It roots out dangerous assumptions that could mean the project is doomed to failure. And I will, again, discuss that quite a lot as well, because I think it's an important one. It allows decisions to be made based on evidence rather than on guesswork. And this might be slightly self-evident one, but it's one that companies come to realize over time, that as soon as you have evidence, you are much more likely to make a decision that is a successful decision, one that makes a real difference. Otherwise, you are basically making a decision based on guesswork, or what you think the situation is, or on something that you imagine to be when it might be something completely different. It gives the teams the knowledge it needs to make great products and services that really fit user needs. And I think this is the more well-known purpose that's more related to user research. And where we started out, I suppose, is understanding users and doing research with users specifically, which is also a very key part of the whole thing. But I feel like the other purposes are actually more valuable in the end. And that's the purpose of research, when it really gets embedded into the whole project that a company or organization is doing. And I'll discuss more about that as we go along. And essentially what we always say is that evidence-based decisions are better decisions, which seems like a no-brainer in a sense, but it's the thing that we often have to work with companies to help them to understand, that if you're making decisions with no evidence or no real understanding of what you're doing, then the likelihood of that being a good decision is much, much lower than if you're basing it on evidence. And over time, that becomes obvious as a project goes along. So where does research come in, or where should you do some research? Well, as we see it, research is useful at any stage of a project, but where it is most valuable is in defining the goals of the project right at the very beginning. And most researchers who've been working for any length of time will know this, but a lot of companies aren't aware of this. So they will try to bring research in at a later stage in a project when decisions have already been made, possibly based on false assumptions and unclear evidence. And the problem is, at that point, the research can't necessarily put the project back on the right direction, or there is a danger that effort and time has been already spent on doing the wrong thing. And that's where projects really get into trouble then, because they're stuck on a direction that isn't going to work. So we've been in situations where we've come in on a project at a later stage and with great effort turned it back around, or we've come into a project at a later stage and said that they're going in the wrong direction and we've been ignored, which is one of the problems. Or we've come in and we've done the research and we've not really been able to turn the project around at that stage. So it is much more difficult at a later stage in a project for research to have that real impact. Basing the foundation of a project on evidence greatly increases the chances of success. So if you have that due diligence of the research being done right at the start, then the foundation of your project is solid. You're basing it on good knowledge, good understanding, and good evidence. So it's much more likely that you're going to have success in the long run. And then research can be done at all stages of the project from there on in, to monitor and reassess goals, to inform decisions, to allow the project to change if necessary, and to avoid errors and wasted effort. So as a tool, it's not about just gathering data and putting it up on a nice pie chart. Sorry, Florence Nightingale, who is the originator of the pie chart, they're not always that useful. It's about what is the purpose of this research? What decision is being made? Can we make this decision? Or do we need some evidence to be able to choose the right direction? So it's about using it, picking it up as a tool again and again and again throughout a project, as and when it's needed, in a really adaptive way. And I will also discuss that as we're going along. So let's talk about goals. And as I was saying, research that comes in right at the beginning when the goals of a project are defined is where it's going to have its most effect. Because poorly defined goals can kill a project dead before it even starts. It forms the foundation of the project. It gives the team the understanding of where they're going. And if goals are poorly defined, then the understanding of where that project is going, the ability to make good decisions, is undermined right from the beginning. So poorly defined goals, just to give a quick overview of them, use vague terms like better or more or easy to use. And these are the things we come across a lot when we're first coming into projects, and we have to ask, what is better? What do you mean by more? What do you mean by easy? These words don't necessarily mean anything until you operationalize them, until you understand what it's actually supposed to say. They tend to be based on a poor understanding of the current situation, the customer, the market, so they have poor evidence behind them, so they don't really have an understanding of what you're dealing with. They don't have all the necessary information at your hand. Are often based on assumptions, and we'll talk more about assumptions in a minute. And an example is, which we come across this version of this goal every now and again, is we want to improve this service so we get more sales. It's a goal, but it's not a clear one. What does improve mean? What does more mean? And how will the improvement be measured? How do you know when it's better? So it's all about understanding what it is you're really trying to achieve. And so design research allows you to set a clear goal for your project that has a high chance of success. It's about really setting that goal early, doing the work up front so that you know what the process is that you're trying to get through to get to a measurable conclusion. So clearly defined goals are, to clearly define a goal, you need to know how things are now, why they are where they are, and how you would like them to be. Three quite simple things in terms of how they're stated, but actually much, much harder than they seem. So when we work with a client, we'll often ask them, how are things now? What is the situation with your customers? What is the situation with this product? If it's a product they're trying to improve, why are things like that? Why are customers not choosing this product? Why are our customers having a difficulty with this product? Why is there a gap in the market as you see it? Why does that gap exist? And for a lot of companies, they have difficulty at that point in answering those questions because they don't have that information to hand. And the problem is, if you don't have that information to hand, you don't know what you're starting out with. You're starting out with in an unknown location, trying to get to an unknown location makes it a lot harder to find your way. And another key part of it is how you would like things to be. And again, this is a tough one. So I will say to companies, what are you trying to achieve? What will success look like? And they will have a vague understanding of what that's supposed to be. It needs to be better, more, improved. But without a clearer understanding of what you're trying to achieve, you don't know, for example, what your resources will need to be. We want to have more customers. Well, how many more? And how many more customer support people are you going to need for that? So it's all about practicalities as well when it comes to understanding how you would like them to be, because if you want 1 million more customers, but you don't have the capacity to provide support to 1 million customers, then is that goal realistic? Are you really going to achieve that? Or is there work you need to do to make that happen? So it's all about understanding and defining and having a real clear idea of where you're trying to be. And if you struggle to give clear, explicit details on any of this, then you need research. And this is where research really comes in useful. Oops, I lost my clicky. So let's talk about assumptions, because assumptions are the thing that we have to tackle quite strongly right at the beginning of every project and all the way through, to be honest, as well. And what we say is that assumptions are traps that you set for yourself. So in business, there are lots of unpredictable things. The market can go up and down. There can be a pandemic. Stuff can happen. You can have a competitor come in that you didn't anticipate, all of that. But assumptions are traps that you set for yourself. Assumptions are essentially things that little landmines that you are laying around in front of yourself that you may step on in 2 months' time, in 6 years' time, in 10 years' time. And the problem with assumptions is that they can hide in plain sight. So, and they can be about any aspect of the project that you're working with. They can be about the problem being solved, the customer, the market, the team, anything. And they're often plausible. And this is the problem. People don't often realize that what they think is right is actually an assumption. And that's often because they're usually not quite right. So they sound like they could be right, or they sound like they're almost right. But the problem is even small errors can have a big effect. So even if your assumption is almost right, but not quite right, it can have a major impact on the project. And the example I always use, because I think it really surprises people, is the extent to which assumptions almost sank Lego as a company. Up until 2003, Lego was, well, in the early 2000s, Lego was in serious trouble. They were almost on the edge of bankruptcy. And they were making lots and lots of different products, and they were trying all different avenues, and they had tried to get into lots of new different markets. And they had a new CEO in 2003 who said, right, stop, where are we? What's going wrong? And they had to look at what they understood about their market, what they understood about children. And what they realized is that they had made massive assumptions on how children play. Essentially, they didn't know their customers at all. One of the key things is that they assumed that children play in a solitary fashion with the Lego. And when they went and observed children playing with Lego, they realized that they play socially, that they argue, that they compare, that they have competitions. And because of that assumption, they had made ranges and ranges of toys that just had no market, that children didn't enjoy, that there was no hook for children to get into. When they started to understand this social play and this interaction, then they started to develop new products that had a real hold on the market. And of course, now Lego is, depending on who you ask, is number one or number two as a toy company in the world, is massively, massively profitable, very, very successful. And a lot of that is based on the fact that they turned things around, did some research, challenged all of their assumptions, and found out what the actual situation is, and based all of their decisions on that going forward. And the problem with assumptions is that they can damage the whole foundation of a project, and the effect may not be obvious for years. So Kodak assumed that they would always have the corner of the market that the digital photography would never take off. And Kodak was a very well-established company who had a long history of success, and that assumption sank them within a few years. And those assumptions can pop up at any point, and the difficulty is that often people struggle to even see that they're there. And it's what we do quite a lot, is say, how do you know this thing? And if you don't know how you know it, then chances are it's an assumption, and you need to have a look at it and take it apart and figure out whether your assumption is justified or not. So this is an example. It's just a completely made up example, but it's a bit of a challenge for you to spot the potential assumptions. So say there's a company and they've decided that they want to develop a whole new product, and they reckon they have a market and they reckon it's going to be a great success. So they say, we want to develop an app to give people the knowledge they need to stop wasting their money and budget effectively. So as a goal, it seemed like quite a detailed goal. It seems like they have an understanding at least of what they're trying to achieve. But what we would first do is, when we come across this as a goal, is we would start to pick out the assumptions. So a quick challenge that I have for you is to just think for a couple of minutes. You can obviously just keep it to yourself and write it down if you'd rather not share it. If you want to talk about it and give a comment, please let Michael know or Joe, and they will let me know that you want to comment and you can speak out loud. If you would like to just share your comments over chat, please do. So just write in it what you think, and I will, and Michael will relay that to me. So I will give you a couple of minutes, and your challenge is to spot the assumptions, or the potential assumptions, because they may not be. I feel like you should play some music here at this point.
I feel like we should have a countdown clock.
Do, 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 do. So if anyone wants to say their answer out loud or just have a discussion or ask a question even, just put that in the chat. So say I would like to speak and let Michael know, and he can just let me know who wants to speak then. Otherwise, Michael will just read your answers out and I'll discuss them then.
Yeah, so we're getting a few in now. So first one that came through is.
Well, no, let's wait for a minute.
Or do you want to wait for everyone's before and then I'll analyse it?
Okay. Yeah, give people a chance to think it through. Okay, so I'll just leave it 30 more seconds. So if you have any other comments or you would like to ask a question or talk, speak, then that's fine. Just let us know. Okay, so let's get started. Michael, if you want to let me know if anyone wants to speak first, and then we can go through.
So we haven't had any volunteers to say that they want to talk.
That's fine. I'll get them eventually, don't worry.
But yeah, big one that seems to be coming up a lot is around the term wasted. So or wasting, that people have actually, the assumption there that people are actually wasting their money, that this is happening.
Yeah.
And then obviously that knowledge is the problem.
Yeah.
And another one is around effectively. What does budgeting effectively actually mean?
Yep. Any further comments?
Well, no, there's lots of them around those. Really, it's sort of that's the main focus seems to be those three words.
Yes.
And there's a few that sort of mentioned actually that there's a desire to change how they currently budget, or that that there's that what's happening at the moment is that people want to change it.
Yep. Yeah, I feel like there's some very experienced assumption spotters in the group. Yes, I think it's fair to say that there are quite a few assumptions in this, and I would agree with all of those that have been brought up. To give people the knowledge they need, there's an assumption there that they need knowledge, and that's the solution to the problem. To stop wasting their money, I would say wasting money is very much a value judgment. What is considered wasting by one person is considered a perfectly good expenditure by another person, and there's often gendered assumptions around that as well, that wasting money on a handbag, for example, is one thing, or wasting money on golf is another thing. That people to budget effectively, what does the word effectively mean? How do you actually say that someone has budgeted effectively? And also I think an assumption in there, and I don't know if someone pointed it out, I can't quite remember if someone said it, is that an app will help. So this is an assumption that we've come across quite often, is that apps will solve the world, that technology will solve the world, and that a situation that has been quite intractable and difficult to solve for a long time, such as how do you get people to manage their money effectively, manage their money in such a way that they have enough to live off, it will be solved by something as simple as an app. And it is something that we come across quite often, especially with social situations. And I see, actually, I've opened the chat there, I see that Ash actually mentioned that. So yeah. And then another thing I would say here is that it says we want to develop an app to give people the knowledge. Now, this is something we come across as well. there are 7 billion people and some in the world. So the question is, are you trying to serve everybody from birth up to the end of their lives? You have no discrimination between anybody. No particular group of people that you're targeting, no particular circumstances, no particular age range, no particular wages or type of lifestyle. And I think this is one of the key things, especially around user research, is trying to understand who it is you're actually trying to cater for, and what defines that group. Is that group different in some way, and what are their characteristics? So for a company that was giving us this as their goal, what we would do first is obviously this process of going down through them. And I have actually done it with companies before, especially startups, where I've written, they find it quite a painful process, where I just ask them a question and I write their words up on the board, on a whiteboard. Whiteboards are very important in our business, as most of us know. And I will scrutinize every single word in what they say and say, right, tell me what this means. What do you mean by people? What do you mean by knowledge? What do you mean by wasting? What do you mean by effectively? What counts as a budget? And what is the actual goal? So the thing with this as well is that there isn't really a goal there, in the sense that there isn't what benefit will these people have? Will they have more money? Will they live more securely? Will they be able to pay their bills more easily? You also have to break down what it is that you're trying to achieve for people. What is the benefit? What is the value? And what is the purpose of something like this? And a question as well that often goes unanswered at this point, and what I will bring up here, is how are you going to make money from this? Now, you think in a business situation, that's a question that people are ready to answer. This is a key principle of business, that if you are developing a product, you want people to pay for that product in some way so that your company can make a profit. But often when I ask this question, how are you going to make money from it, that isn't a question that is even being considered. And it is a funny one, because I kind of think, well, if as a business you are trying to make money, if you're not a charity or you're not doing this as a kind of a social good sort of thing, then you need to have a model that generates income for your company. And you need to understand, what is it that people are going to pay for here? So if you were developing an app like this, why would people pay money for it? What would be the benefit to them that would make them think, yes, this is worth money to me. This is something I'm going to pay for because it does things more, it does something for me that another product can't do. Now, I know I have scheduled in a break next, so we have a little bit of time before that. If anyone wants to ask any questions about what we've talked about so far, or any comments or anything they would like to clarify before we move on later to something a little bit different. Don't be shy, or else I'll have to start calling on people. I won't. Don't worry about that. Go ahead, Chantal.
A question for you. I have a lot of, I guess, product owners that want me to ask customers whether they would use something in the future to validate the product that they've designed. Is there a better way that I can test whether a product is actually going to have value? So you mentioned, why would people pay for it? What is the benefit to them? But unless people have used the product, they won't know that.
That's a really good question, and that's a question we come across a lot. I will state very, very strongly, because this is based on a lot of experience, that asking people about their hypothetical behavior in the future is utterly, utterly pointless, because it tells you literally nothing. People will, unless you're asking people, will you eat this rotten piece of fruit in the future, which the unequivocal answer is no. For the most part, the answer is yes, unless it's something really unpleasant. Because why not? So unless people have a real aversion to what you're suggesting for some reason, they're not going to have really good reasons why they won't engage in that hypothetical behavior in the future. It's going to give you lots of false positives, essentially. So often if you ask someone, will you use this product in the future, they go, yeah, why not? Because I haven't, I know what's going on in my life now. I know what's important to me now. I know how I make a decision in the moment, but I don't necessarily know what the situation is going to be down the road. It's even difficulty with this pandemic when governments are asking people, will you engage in this behavior in the future? People will feel like, oh no, I won't go to the cinema, or I won't do this, I won't do that. But until they're in the moment, it's really hard to judge what that actual behavior is going to be. Now, answering that question is much more complicated. And I would say that any product that you're developing is about solving a problem. So if your product, for example, is solving the problem of people budgeting, firstly, you need to understand, does that problem exist? Do people genuinely have issues with budgeting? So you need to go out there and figure that out with your target audience, whoever that might be. And then another good way of figuring out whether your product is going to be a good choice for them is, how do they currently solve that problem? So do they use a spreadsheet? If they're using a spreadsheet, is that spreadsheet doing the solving the problem for them really well at the moment, in which case your product might not be an improvement? Or is that spreadsheet just a bit messy and a bit hinky and difficult for them to use, in which case you're going to simplify the issue for them? Because if someone is already solving the problem in this certain way, it's actually really, really valuable to find that out, because you can see what is it that's important to these people. Why are they doing it like this? What is it about this spreadsheet that's really giving them some value in their lives? Why are they going to the effort of setting up a spreadsheet with macros and calculators and whatever? Because obviously whatever this is doing for them is solving a real issue in their life. What is that issue? What is it that it's making better for them? Is it that it's allowing them to view their expenditure in a really clear way so they can see where they could reduce some money? Or is it allowing them to identify when they could get a better bargain in a certain place? So it's really digging into the behavior of people, because that's what shows what's really going on. Opinions and hypotheticals are usually very, very unstable in terms of deciding what people are actually going to do. And for whatever you're doing, whatever project you're developing, unless it's something way out there that has never ever been done before, there will always be real world examples of how people are dealing with it now. There will always be real world examples of how that's working at the moment. And if you go and get that information, then you can identify where this product can come in. Look, at this point, there's a big gap. They're moving loads of data from one thing to another in a really awkward fashion. If we put in a product that did that for them and displayed that data in a really nice way, because they're using that data, but it's a mess, then they're going to go, yes, it solved a problem for me. So it really is about figuring out that problem. Where is that problem? Are you solving it? And are you solving it in a better way than what's already there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was really, really helpful. Thank you so much.
And we'll go into that a bit more as well just after the break. So I'll talk a bit more about that, because I have a bit more kind of focused stuff on that. Now, a couple of more minutes before we have a quick break. So if anyone else has a question, please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Tasha.
This may be a side question, maybe not related to the problem, but when you're doing this assumption exercise, how do you make sure that the right people are in the room to get all the answers?
That's a really good question. And basically what I do is I sit down with the clients and I say, right, who needs to be in on this project? And they will give me one or two people, and I'll say, and is there anybody else that's going to come up later on and say, oh, what about this and what about that? And they say, oh, okay, maybe this person and that person. And then I say, and is there anybody else who's going to have to actually implement this? And they say, oh, yes, this person. And then they say, right, what about the people who actually have to build this thing? Oh, yeah, we should also have them. So I have to do basically the legwork of helping them to identify who it is that should be in the room. And essentially it's everybody from every section of a project that has an influence on that project needs to be in that room, because I need their information. If their information gets left out, then it will come up, it will inevitably come up at a later stage and cause problems. Now, I would say that I have this discussion, I'm very, very firm about it at the very beginning, and every single time, almost every single time, someone still pops up later on in the project and says, oh, what about? So I've sort of just factored that into how I work, really, but it is a tough one. And I think for some reason that I don't really understand, and maybe someone could give me some understanding of it, there is often resistance to having all those people in the room. I think there is a resistance. There's often a desire to kind of keep it to a certain group of people. And what I try to explain to people is that, firstly, if you exclude people, then decisions are being made on their behalf that they don't necessarily agree with, and that they will have a really good reason for not being able to implement. So you don't want to find that out later on. You want to find it out now, not 6 months down the road when things have already gone way too far to roll it all back. And also, everybody who's in the room when we have these discussions has something valuable to give, and is very useful to me as a researcher, because I'm researching with the group in the room as much as I am with anybody outside it, because there is a huge resource of knowledge within any team that's going unused, and I dig all of that out and use it. And often with companies, I'm bringing them back their own knowledge and saying, here, you knew all this already, you just didn't know you knew it. And so that's really valuable. So I think it's a matter of being quite dogged about it. That's what I do. I don't know if that's helpful.
That was extremely helpful. Thank you.
Right, what we're going to do is have a quick break. Please, if you did have a question there or something came up for you, you will have a chance to ask it. But we'll just have a quick break of about 5 minutes now. I'll switch off my camera just to give me time to also have a little break. So we'll get started now again. Okay, so we talked a bit about assumptions and setting goals, and we're going to talk now a bit about how to plan and implement great research. So this is the key part, I suppose, about how you actually do research in whatever context that you're doing it, but especially when you're doing this goal setting side of things. What we always say is that research should be an iterative process, adapting as needed depending on what you find out. And again, I think this is not something we often come across really when we've seen research happening previously in companies that we've worked with. It's been very static, or it's been to answer one very particular aspect of one very particular project. What we found with clients is that when research comes in as a tool that they kind of pick up and put down as they need it on an ongoing basis, that's when it really becomes ridiculously useful, in the sense that every time that something comes up there where there's a gap in the knowledge, or there's an assumption they have to challenge, or there's something they need, like some new piece of information that's really important, then they turn to research and say, right, well, now we need to know this, and this is something we need to make a decision on, but we can't make a decision until we really know what's happening here. Research gets involved, and then the answer is given, and it comes back, and then that feeds in again, and it changes the process, and it informs how things move forward. In terms of the method, the method is dictated by what you need to find out, and methods need to be adapted to the particular situation. So what we find often as well is there's a very, very particular focus on the method. So use a survey, use an interview. But if that method is not suitable for that particular situation, for that particular group of people that you're working with, then there's no point in using it. So it's all about really understanding what it is you're dealing with, and using the method in a really creative way, or in a way that is going to work for that particular situation. To a certain extent, I think that takes experience and knowledge. It's very difficult to just have that off the bat. So when I'm trying to advise people on methods, it's a very tough one, and I'm always the person who's there saying it depends, which is researchers and UX people are very well known for using that phrase, but it's one that I use a lot because it really does depend. However, I will talk through some methods now and give you an idea of how they might be used, and we can have a discussion about it later as well if you would like more information on that part. The process of planning the research is as important as the research itself, if not more important. The reason for that is because the research is all about what is it going to give you in the end. So again, I've seen research being done, and there is no understanding of why it's being done necessarily, or what question it's there to answer. All of the real due diligence and work and hard thinking in research comes in the planning. Why are we doing this research? What question are we trying to answer? Where will this get us? What decision is this feeding into? Why are we finding this out? What do we really need to find out? What are the key pieces of information we need about this situation that will really tell us a story, really let us understand what's going on here? Often I'll see data that's collected that's just random pieces of information, and you can't actually make a coherent argument or understanding from that information, and in which case that data is just not useful. You can't do anything with it, you just have to bin it. And I think that's often where research comes a cropper, is when research is done just for the sake of it and no one actually knows what to do with it in the end. It's not actually answered any question. It's like 20% of people think this, well, okay, so what? And research needs to answer specific questions, and that's basically what I was saying there. It needs to not gather lots of useless data. And it interests me that people are very concerned about companies gathering lots and lots of data about them, and it is a valid concern. But then what I see is companies gathering lots and lots of data and doing nothing with it because it doesn't have any use. They haven't collected that data for any reason. It doesn't tell you anything about anybody. There isn't anything coherent it can tell you, or it can tell you one very particular thing about someone when people are complex. You know, I looked at a pair of shoes on Facebook because I hate them, and now I'm getting ads for that shoe, those shoes, and shoes like them forevermore. But people choose to look at things for different reasons, and just knowing that they've looked at something is not a useful piece of information about them, really. So again, it's about coherence, it's about data that's actually useful, it's about rich understanding and not just data points or quantitative data. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I'm going to focus on designing a product or service, because obviously I've said that you can use this research, you can use research at any point to understand your team or understand the business model of the company you're working with, or any aspect of the company. But focusing on designing a product or service is useful in the sense that it's a lot of what people on this workshop will have experience with, but also it's quite a focused project, and it's where research can really make a big difference as to how successful that product or service is. So again, this might be obvious to a lot of people, but it's a list of things that you need to know, and it's definitely not an exhaustive list. But essentially, when you're designing a product or service, you need to know specifically, and I've put the word specifically there for a reason. So not generically, not vaguely, not almost. What problem you're solving, and that goes back to what we were discussing before the break about the problem that you're solving. Is it a real problem? Now, again, this seems like maybe a strange question to ask, but it's something I've had to talk through with companies before. Is this a problem that you've made up, that you think exists, and it doesn't? A very silly example is from Grace and Frankie, if anyone's watched the new series where a woman says she wants to make candy for dogs because everyone likes candy. Do dogs really need candy? I mean, maybe they do, maybe they'd say yes, but you have to think about whether you're developing a product to solve a problem that really exists or to solve a problem that you think exists. And finding that out is really key, because if you're not solving any problem, if you're not developing a product that people need, then you might as well forget it from the beginning, because there just isn't a market for it. And very closely related to that point is why the problem exists, what causes it, and can you actually fix it? And I suppose, again, this goes back to a bit what we were discussing before the break is, why is this a problem in the first place? Why are people having difficulty with this, or why do they need this thing? What causes this problem, and can you fix it? So when we're talking about the budgeting issue, the question there is, can you solve the problem of people not having enough money if essentially the reason people have enough money is because the economic system disadvantages them and they can't earn enough money? There is a bigger problem at play, so you have to understand what element of it you're dealing with, and can you fix that problem genuinely? Can you maybe solve a simpler problem? Is the problem you're tackling too big and you've gone too ambitious? And that's actually something we come across quite a lot as well, is overambitiousness, is trying to solve a huge problem when actually solving a smaller problem is probably more realistic and is more useful in the end. And we may talk a bit more about that later. Who the problem exists for. Again, another very key one. Who is it that you're actually engaging with? Who are the people that you're going to be talking to as your customer? Do they have particular characteristics? Is there someone who has a very specific workplace that they work in? That means you need to be aware of it. You know, don't develop a product, for example, that requires people to hear things if they work in a really busy office, because they will always have to wear headphones, and are they okay with that? Maybe, but you need to figure that out. Is it a specific demographic that you're trying to work with, younger people, older people? You need to understand who is it your target customer. If your target customer is the whole world, then it's very difficult to target the entire world, because you don't know the characteristics of the entire world. You don't know what the entire world needs. It is easier and more sensible to target a specific group of people, at least at the very beginning, and then understand whether you can branch that out to other things. Having a target customer is very good focusing the mind, very good helping to understand who those people are. And again, we mentioned this before the break as well. How do they already solve the problem? And that doesn't mean there is a competitor product there, but understanding who the competitor is and what they do can be really useful. But if there is no competitor, if they're just using workarounds, if they're using a whiteboard in their hand, or they're using post-it notes, how do they use those things to make this problem work? How are they actually working around this situation? And knowing how people already solve a problem is such a useful source of information, because it shows you, firstly, how they're organizing that information themselves, and what it is that they're actually trying to do with this information. What are they trying to achieve, and how are they achieving it? What are the things that they're focusing on? Because if you can take how they're solving the problem and make it even better, then they're going to love you forever, obviously, because you've taken their solution that already works and make it work even better, and giving it back to them in a way that it just simplifies their life. And for the most part, what people want is for things to be simpler. That's mostly what people need in their lives. How your solution will be better, why will people choose you? Now, we've worked with a few clients where they're wanting to move into a very competitive market, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But then the question we always ask is, why are people going to then move away from these other competitors who are very successful to choose you instead? What makes you better? And sometimes the answer will be, we're cheaper, which isn't always an answer that makes sense. Sometimes the answer can be, well, we're better, but in what way? How are you an improvement? Are you offering the same product essentially? Again, offering the same product is not necessarily a bad thing, but then you have to understand that you are in severe competition with somebody else, and you are trying to grab a market that is already saturated, perhaps potentially, without any reason for people to go to you, and you're competing against a well-known name, and you're competing against all of the work that they've already done to secure customers. The thing is, if you improve the product by understanding what users need, even by a very tiny amount, that can give you such a competitive advantage that you knock the other competitor out of the park, no matter how established they are. And sometimes that comes from identifying just something that no one ever thought of before. Netflix is a good example of that, streaming things into people's homes rather than broadcasting them out on television. You know, it wasn't something they necessarily did huge amounts of research to find out. It was something they hit upon, but research can allow you to hit upon those things quite easily, actually. And that's often what ends up happening with the clients that we work with, is that they say, oh, we were going to do this thing, but it turns out this thing is more sensible. This is the thing that people actually need. Yes, I'll talk about that again in a minute. Design research allows you to answer these questions. Basically, it allows you to understand, well, what are you designing, and will it have any place in the world? Will it have an actual market? Or if you're designing something in a government organization, will this actually work for the people we're working with? Is it actually going to solve a problem for people, or is it just going to make things worse? Is it going to add more bureaucracy and more red tape, which is obviously something you don't want? So I have an example. We want to develop an app that improves the clothes shopping experience. Now, this obviously is a completely fictional example and a very, very basic example as well. So it would be quite rare for a company to have maybe this vague a goal, but we'd say that a company is a startup. They decide that they want to develop something. They know that the clothes shopping experience is not good because the retail sector is struggling. So they decide they want to develop an app and they want it to improve the clothes shopping experience, because they figure if we improve the clothes shopping experience, then we will have a market and we will make an app that is successful. So that's their explanation. Bearing in mind, this is a very basic example just to talk through these principles. So if we're working with this company right at the very beginning and they've made the sensible choice of including research right from the start, and then obviously the first process that we go through with them is defining the goal. So we want to develop an app that improves the clothes shopping experience. Now I'm going to throw these questions out to you and you can comment or you can speak or you can ask a question of your own if you like. They're not very hard questions, hopefully. And you can write your answers in the chat as we've done before, and I'll take a look in a minute. So really, I suppose the first question is this a clearly defined goal? I've sort of answered that question already, to be fair, because it isn't really a very clearly defined goal, but a more key question is, what are the potential assumptions in this goal? What are the potential pitfalls of these assumptions, and what are the next steps? So I'll give you a minute to just think about what the assumptions are with this, and any comments, any questions that you have as well, please feel free to jump in with them. Okay, I'll just leave 30 more seconds, and if anyone has any questions or would like to comment as well, please just put that in the chat and I'll call on you as well. Okay, Michael, do you want to have a look and see what comments we've had?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we've got some really good ones. So again, obviously, there's the app, the dreaded word. There's an assumption there that the app's a solution. It's going to make things better. Of course, it is. There's no sort of acknowledgement of what the problem is. So it's talking about improving without talking about what the problem is. Who are we doing it for? And more specifically, a really good point a few people have made, which is there's sort of an assumption that clothes shopping experience is a thing, that there's one universal clothes shopping experience that can be improved, without any acknowledgement that obviously there's plenty of different experiences out there.
Exactly, and of course the potential pitfalls of these assumptions is that the company goes ahead and tries to just develop this very vague thing, and there isn't any real direction to what they're doing. So they're ranging around just doing lots of different things. They're trying to improve things. There's no sense of what they're improving or who they're improving it for. I'm getting a note here from GoToMeeting that there's network connection difficulties. Is there anyone having trouble hearing, or is the connection okay for most people? Let me know if you're all fine.
Yeah, it seems to be fine.
Okay, good. Sometimes it gives you that notice, and it gives me a bit of a fright. Like, is it actually, can people hear me? Yeah, so and actually something as weakly defined as this, maybe not quite this bad, isn't that unusual in our experience. And I think there is often a kind of a sense that you set this goal and then you start your process of design and you start developing a prototype. But the difficulty of just using something as badly defined as this is that you don't have any parameters for what you're doing. You don't know what it is you're aiming at. And what we often find in this situation as well is that there's a lot of wasted effort. It's very frustrating for people to work in this sort of situation because they're trying things and they're doing things, but they don't know why they're doing them necessarily or what the effect is going to be. And anyone who has developed a product or service knows the amount of effort that goes into it. And any wasted effort is very expensive as well. Anytime that something is developed with no real purpose or that has no effect on anything, it has a huge amount of wasted effort behind it. So this is why we say that then research has to come in at this point, because you have to really understand what it is you're trying to achieve. And it also allows you to identify very early on what the potential is for a product like this, because even if you come up with something as vague as this, you can then use research to narrow it down to something that actually has a real potential for success. I'm just having a look at the chat there myself. So Jasper said a good point as well, that it assumes crossover between people who shop for clothes and people who use apps, which is definitely a good one to point out, because it depends on who it is you're aiming at. And if you're aiming at an older generation especially, although that's an assumption to make there as well, but generally people who are older will have different shopping habits to people who are younger, won't necessarily use technology in that situation. And there's also an assumption that people are having a poor experience currently. So yes, there is issues in the clothes retail market, but what is the reason for that? Why are people not engaging with the clothes shopping experience in face-to-face? Now, obviously in a pandemic, this is a different situation. So bearing in mind, this is in normal world, non-pandemic world that we're talking about here. Obviously pandemics create a different situation, an interesting situation when it comes to questions like this. So what are the next steps? Well, if we were working with this company, bearing in mind that, again, this is a simplified version of what we would be doing with them, we would start to do some research. And as I was saying before, research is an iterative process. So it isn't the case that we're now going to sit down and plan a huge research project from start to finish where we know all of the activities that we're going to do. Generally, we will start at the most basic level of research, especially if this is something that's completely new and there's very little understanding of it already. So there's a new company, they don't have any new kind of great understanding of this situation. So the first obvious place to start is desk research. It's cheap, it's quick, it's not going to take a long time, and it's something you can do easily within your own office. And it's actually something that is quite badly neglected by companies as well, because there is a lot of there's a lot of information that's already out there. There's plenty of research done in every realm of experience by academic researchers who spend day in and day out carrying out research, so use it. So an example, maybe you look at some academic research that into the clothes retail industry, specifically looking at consumer behavior and how people choose clothes. What is already out there? What research has been done? Who has that research been done with? What have they found? Is there anything interesting there? Is there a pattern? But remember that you also have your own knowledge. You obviously have shopped for clothes yourself, and there are people around you who also shop for clothes. So ask some questions, interrogate yourself, sit yourself down and think, what do I do? What are the things that I find difficult? Now, going off your own experience should always be done with a big caveat in mind, which is that you have a hidden agenda, not so hidden agenda, which is that you want this to work. So bearing in mind that, you know, your own input on the whole thing is a little bit suspect. But people that you talk to around, if you just ask them about their experiences, you might find out some interesting things. You might start thinking, oh, people are mentioning the same thing over and over. This is interesting. I'll go back to my desk research and I'll find out whether there's a bit more information on that. Start narrowing it down, start finding things out, start pinpointing things that look interesting. I mean, it's a very kind of childish way to put it, but I also almost think it's like being a detective. It's trying to piece together a case so that if I had to prove in court, yes, this is a really good idea, I can bring up all my evidence, all my exhibits, all my bits of information that show that this is all making a coherent story that I can tell from start to finish. Or a more relevant situation is when I'm going in front of investors. So what I'll always say to a new company is that an investor will want to know, why do you think this is going to be a success? And if you can't produce this information, if you can't even show that you've done your basic due diligence around academic research, never mind your own research, then investors very often will say, well, you've not really shown that you can make this work. You've not shown that you have a basis for this idea. Anyone who's watched Dragon's Den, I think it's called something different in the US. It's that investment program where you have to come and present your idea. Will have seen those ideas where the person clearly hasn't thought them through and hasn't anything to say whether it's going to work or not. And what you're looking for is clear problems and patterns. What are the issues that are mentioned often? What are the things that catch your interest? What are the things that look like there might be something there? And interpretation. So say when you're looking through, again, like I say, you're looking for patterns. So say, for example, this is what you find out. So interpretation of academic research just means reading through a lot of it and trying to find things that match up, trying to trace these things back and understand all the different pieces that are feeding into it. So say that you find these things out. Women are 3 times as likely as men to report that they struggle to find clothes that fit and that this makes clothes shopping stressful. It isn't exactly clear why, so you can't find a solid answer to it. We don't know what's causing that problem. The industry believes that struggling to find clothes that fit reduces the amount of money women spend on clothes. So this is the thing, that the light bulb that should be going in your head at this moment is, So there is a belief that this is a problem and that actually if you solve this problem, that there would be a market for it, that there would be, at least the industry would be interested in it as a thing. In online shopping, the vast majority of returns are due to the clothes ordered not fitting properly. Okay, so fit is a problem, apparently. So what do you do next? So you've redefined the goal now. So you've used your research and you've actually fed it back into the goal. So your new goal is, we want to develop an app that helps women. So now you've narrowed down your target audience, women, still not very well defined, but it's better than the whole world, to find clothes that fit. So you've narrowed down this goal to something more specific because you have found in the research that this may be an issue that really exists. So the next step that you might take here is qualitative research with your target audience, and your target audience being women. So there's lots of women around, 50% of the population, so it's not too hard to identify them. And what you might want to find out here, and this is a point at which, again, you have quite a limited amount of information about what you're dealing with. So you're just finding out, what is this problem? Where does this problem exist? Again, you're piecing together pieces of information. You've got an inkling that there's something going on, and now you're starting to piece together real information from what actually exists in the world. So why do women struggle to find clothes that fit? You haven't been able to find that out from the academic research, so maybe you need to find that out yourself. What is the real problem? What is the issue here? How do they currently solve the problem, and how well does that solution work? What do? Do they order lots of clothes and send lots of clothes back? Do they always go to face-to-face shopping because that's easier to find the clothes that they find a fit? Do they ask their friends for recommendations? Is there an app they already use? Is there something that they've already found that helps them? Is this a real problem that I can actually solve? So is it the case that this is going to be something that I can get involved with and actually make a difference in, or is this such an intractable problem in the industry that maybe I want to stay well away from it? Is there a market for a potential solution? If I develop something, are people going to pay for it? Maybe it won't be customers, maybe it'll be the clothes selling industry who want more people to buy clothes. Maybe I can offer them a solution. Who knows? So qualitative research is about developing a rich understanding of a situation on a small scale. I consider qualitative research to be the real go-to thing in really getting an understanding of a situation, because in qualitative research, you are talking to somebody about their experience and you're exploring it with them. And it gives you that really rich, detailed information. It doesn't give you data points on a graph, which can often be very, very difficult to interpret. It gives you that, what's actually happening? Why is this leading to that? Why have you made that decision? But the key thing about qualitative research, especially if you're doing something like interviews or focus groups, is that questions need to be designed in advance, but you also need to be adaptable to pick up unexpected answers. Because the whole point of qualitative research usually is you're trying to find things out. You're trying to pick the things up that might be interesting, that might be something. And so you have to, if someone says something unexpected to you, you need to be able to then follow up on that question and find out more and dig more deeply into it. And again, I think that's something that takes a bit of experience. It's not necessarily something you can pick up straight off the bat, but with some time, it actually gets a lot easier. Very strong listening skills are required. And again, that takes experience. So it needs to be the case that you can listen to the clue that a person is giving you and then follow up and ask more about it. So if someone says, well, I don't do online shopping. Now you could take that answer and just say, right, this person doesn't do online shopping. But the obvious question after that is why? Why don't you do online shopping? Well, I just find it too stressful. You could again leave it at that. That person finds it stressful. But the obvious next question is, why do you find it stressful? Well, because I'm so tired of getting clothes in the post, and then I have to try them on, and then they look awful on me, and then I have to send them back because they don't fit. And it's such a faff having to get the clothes, bring them back to the post office. I'm very disappointed, and I feel it's just so frustrating. And what you're getting at there is more of that feeling that people have, and more of what it is that is really causing the frustration and the problem and the difficulty, and more of a justification for maybe trying to solve that problem. Because if you take away the frustration, make that process simpler, then perhaps that person will choose that solution, will say, oh, now I'm going to do it because you solved this problem for me. A good rule of thumb is to focus on specific situations and behaviors. And this is true of everything that you're looking at, no matter what, whether you're developing a new product, you're looking at a completely different project where you're trying to develop something, some new process or service. Because, and again, I think we discussed this a little bit before the break, because people know what they do, they know how they behave, but they don't necessarily know how will they behave, or they don't necessarily know how will they feel in the future, or what a hypothetical situation might mean to them. But if you say, tell me about the last time you ordered clothes online, they're thinking about a specific experience. They're thinking about what went wrong there. Did that work out for me? Did I enjoy that experience? Was there something that I really found difficult? So you're getting real information about a real situation. Now, of course, if you're thinking about past experiences, it can often be the case that people struggle to remember. So you may want to set up a situation where you ask someone to order clothes online and then talk through it with them. That's an even better scenario in which you're actually eliciting the behavior you want to look at and then talking it through. That's more about observation, and I'll discuss that that approach slightly later on. So interpretation. So you've talked to, say, 15 women. So the thing about qualitative research is that you do it with a small group of people. It's intensive, it takes time. You might want to do it with large groups if that's something you need to do, if it's a very big service. But say in this situation, you're doing quite focused research in a small area, you talk to 15 women. And 8 of the 15 women say they've returned at least 3 items of clothing they ordered online because it didn't fit in the last year. So not a huge amount, but it does happen. 9 of the 15 women said they would spend more money if they could find clothes that fit. Interesting. 10 women commented that size is vary considerably from shop to shop. Okay, so from shop to shop, I don't know whether I'm getting the same size or not. So a 10 in one shop is not the same as a 10 in another shop. Okay, that sounds like a real problem. It sounds like I can't judge if this top is a 10 and this top in another shop is a 10, that they're both going to fit me, which seems like a very basic thing not to be able to figure out. And 5 women commented that they never shop online due to the sizing issue. Again, interesting. So there is an element of people just avoiding online shopping entirely because they don't want to deal with the sizing issue. So maybe you redefine the goal again. We want to develop an app that allows women to determine whether an item of clothing will fit them or not. Interesting. So now you have a much more specific goal about a mechanical process that you're going through of helping people to understand whether a piece of clothing will fit them or not. And the idea being that it'll help to make a decision and it will eventually lead them to a sale. So you're always trying to think through, how does this actually improve the situation and how does it increase the likelihood of success of a particular situation? So if you're able to say, for example, to clothes retailers, this will increase the chances that people will buy from you. That sounds very good to a retailer. That's a goal that they have, is to sell more clothes. So maybe at this point you want to do quantitative research. So say a survey with a bigger group. How widespread is this issue? Does my idea have potential? It's important to gather details about the people who respond to the survey. So what age are they? What are their shopping habits? Because you want to be able to connect behaviors. You want to be able to find a pattern of behavior. Is this particular to just one age group of women, for example? Is it particular to a group of women who buy a certain type of clothes? Maybe it's work clothes, or maybe it's more expensive clothes because they're not willing to spend money on clothes if they don't feel like they're going to fit. Does this wider group have the same problems? Do other problems emerge? So your survey might actually identify something completely new that you didn't expect. So people are saying actually that they have a way of fixing this problem that you didn't see before in your previous research. You're always gathering more and more information. And you use quantitative research, is the way we always do it usually anyway, if we can, is we do qualitative research first and then we carry out quantitative research afterwards, because we use the results of the qualitative research to shape your survey. The reason we do that is because survey questions have to be quite particular, and if you have no general understanding of the situation you're dealing with, it's going to make designing the survey questions really, really difficult. They're going to be really generic and not really get you much information. Whereas if you've done your qualitative research first, you have an idea of what you're dealing with, and you're able to then think, right, well, I know that of this group of women, this was an issue. So I'm going to ask a specific question about this issue and see if more women have the same one. So it is a process of iteration and a process of design where you're leading from one piece of research into the next piece of research, refining, narrowing, finding more out. So quantitative research allows you to validate the findings of your qualitative research. Do these issues exist on a larger scale, or are they just particular to this group? If I've only studied with 15 women, that's not a big enough market for anything. So I need to understand, is there a bigger market? Is there a bigger problem? Quantitative research has to be very focused. Vague questions will get you data that's impossible to interpret. And one thing that I do quite a lot is I take screenshots of surveys that I think are really awful. But all I think when I look at those surveys is I think I hate to be that person who's interpreting it at the other end, because you can't find anything out from that question. It's not telling you anything. Surveys are really hard to design. I'm just saying that now, because I think a lot of people think they can just put a few questions together. And the difficulty is that a single question can be interpreted 100 different ways by 100 different people if you don't write that question as clearly as you possibly can. So it takes a lot of careful calibration to be able to understand how to ask a question. But an example question of what you might ask in this situation is, how strongly do you agree that it is difficult to judge from the size on the label whether an item of clothing will fit or not? if people strongly agree with that, if that's an issue they come across a lot, then you have a greater validation of that being an issue. Now, of course, I've just pulled this out of thin air, so it may not be an issue. It may be something I'm over-egging, but say this is what you find in your research. So your data from your survey says that 68% of respondents agree that it is difficult to judge from the clothes size whether an item of clothing will fit or not. It's quite a high percentage. 55% say they solve the problem by ordering multiple sizes and returning ones that don't fit. So they're sort of leaning on the system at the moment by taking advantage of the fact that companies will allow them free delivery and free returns, which is not great for those companies because it costs them a lot of money to run that system, and is a huge problem for a lot of retailers because they waste a lot of money sending clothes out to people that just get returned, and often they can't sell those clothes on again. They have to throw them away because they've been worn and they're not clean. 85% of respondents say they would buy more clothes online if they could feel more confident that they would fit. Now that's an interesting result, because now you think, oh, okay, so there is potential to actually increase sales in a real way for retailers if we help them with this fit issue, and also solve the problem of people returning clothes that don't fit, which is an expensive issue for them. So your next steps. Redefining the goal again. We want to develop an app that increases online clothes sales. So there's a goal there. It increases online clothes sales. Maybe you need to define that further about what the increases you're expected to see are, but it's a step. By allowing women to determine whether an item of clothing will fit them or not. So you have a much, much clearer goal where you've fed your research in and you have identified at each point what is happening and why that is happening. So now you might delve more deeply into the problem and start thinking about solutions, and involving your users is really important at this point. So you might engage in observation, which I mentioned earlier, sit with the target customer and watch her order clothes online, talk to her, what's going on here? Why are you not choosing that thing? Why do you think that piece of clothing is going to fit you? How often do you end up returning pieces of clothing? Just go through that whole process, see when the clothes arrive. Does she keep those clothes? What was the decision process of keeping those clothes or not? Co-design, work with a group of people to understand what would help them. What would help them to understand whether this piece of clothing is going to fit you or not? What information do you need? And on and on and on. So I don't want to keep going on and on. I'm very conscious of time. But just a word on methods. The method is dictated by the context. So all methods need to be adapted to suit the situation and the question being asked. You are led by what you need to find out, not by the method. Design of the method is key. Badly designed questions get bad data. That's pretty much it for that one. If you're unsure, you start slowly, gather information and use that to guide you. So the information is there, you just need to put it together into something coherent where you start to figure out, what is the data telling me? What more do I need to find out? Where are my gaps? Where do I not know what's going on here? You need to create a coherent story and a complete picture and understand all of the elements that are key to that whole picture, and be adaptable and focus on meaning. Don't focus on frameworks, don't focus on methods. Don't focus on really just doing one thing because that's the thing you do. Focus on, what do I need to find out next? And sometimes it's just you need to ask 3 more people some questions because that would help you to clarify something. Data means nothing. Data that means nothing is worth nothing, basically. If you could have all the data in the world, and if you have nothing to say about it, then it's not worth anything to you. And finally, why do research? Well-run research will always benefit you, no matter how little of it you do. A small amount of research just at your desk will help to clarify things for you, no matter what it is you're doing. It may bring up more questions also, which is the kind of side effect of it. But if you have more questions, then all that tells you is that you need to find out more things. The more detailed the research is, the more likely it is that you will hit on something brilliant. And a lot of things that have been really brilliant have come from people trying to do other things in the first place. Like Post-it notes was developed by someone who was trying to develop really strong glue and instead developed a really weak glue that allowed them to develop Post-it notes. And without Post-it notes, my life would be incomplete. Post-it notes are very important to me. Moving forward without research increases the risk that you will make the wrong decision based on incomplete or inaccurate information. And it's a real shame for people when they invest a lot of time and effort in a project, but there was some foundational element of the project that was wrong, and they're sort of trying to make it work on an ongoing basis, and it just really isn't going to work, no matter how much they try. And my final caveat is that badly run research can be worse than no research at all. So we've been in situations where there has been research done, I say that in inverted commas, and it's told people things that are just not true, because it's badly done. It's conclusions are drawn from research that shouldn't be drawn, and it's led people down the wrong path as well. So one of the things I would say is that try to get someone who knows what they're doing to do the research, or try to really learn how to develop that research yourself if you need to develop those skills. And there we are. So it's time for questions. We can do it the same way as we've done it before. So if you have a question and you would like to just put it in the chat, please feel free to do that. Or if you would like to speak, just indicate that and you can ask the question then.
I believe Elsa's been sitting on a question.
Oh, go on. So Elsa.
Hi, Francis. So the question's around the fact that we've learnt a lot about how the specifics matter, but when you move into a new domain, you've worked in loads of diverse ones, and you know basically nothing about that domain because you're new to it. How do you get from that sort of like needing to get to the detail? How do you switch from that level of like, I don't know enough about this domain to know that detail yet? How do you make that process work? Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Well, I suppose a good example for me is that I worked with the pensions regulator at the end of last year. I'm not a pensions expert. I know how a pension works, and I don't know much else. And I suppose the thing to remember is that in most situations there are experts there, especially for me, when I come into the situation, I'm coming into that client, generally whatever they do, they're experts in it. So obviously the pensions regulator knows a lot about pensions. So I ask them questions, like I was saying before, my research starts within the organization itself, and I take every bit of information I can get from that organization. I sit down with them, I ask them questions, I figure it out, I listen to what they're saying. If that's not enough and it's a new area, then I find out maybe there's somewhere else I can get that information from. In some circumstances, those experts are the users, the people who've already been using that product. If it's a product that's already existing, they know how that product works inside and out. They know how they've used that situation. Or use it in that situation. If it's a situation that I'm not familiar with, like it's a new work situation, then I would insist, if I can, on going and observing that situation and understanding it as best I can, because I need all of that information. I'm sort of like the node where all that information needs to come. And often in an organization, I'm the only one who has all of that information. I end up being the person who has gathered all that information from everybody, and I'm the one who's put it all together in a way that the company never has before. And suddenly they start seeing new connections between things. They think, oh, okay, we knew this and we knew this, but no one actually put those two things together. And now you have, and now it's so obvious where we are with it. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, good. Cheers.
If I could just add to that as well, it's worth saying that when you're starting a new domain as well, your ignorance is also useful, because it means you don't have some of the inbuilt assumptions that often exist for people who've worked in a domain. That's why, personally anyway, I like working in lots of different domains for that very reason, because it gives you that that ability to question what people don't even think is an assumption, because they assume that everyone knows that.
That's a really good point. Yeah. I mean, I've asked questions in meetings with clients where I've thought, gosh, this is a stupid question, but I really need to ask it because I don't understand. And I'll ask the question and they'll say, oh, I don't know, we've never actually thought about that before. And it's suddenly me as an outsider coming in, I have the benefit of I've not been steeped in that situation for years. I've not become jaded. So I'm there coming at it with fresh eyes, and I'm saying, why do you do that? And they'll say, oh, because we've always done it that way. I honestly don't know. And it's only when someone comes in and starts asking the questions that they start thinking, okay, we need to figure out why this is. I know Tasha has a question. Oh, and Jamie, the slides will be available. I'll send them through to you.
Yeah, I'm just curious, when you go and do your outside research, what are your process in showing people the research versus handing them the research?
Yeah, I will usually insist that I have to present the research and talk it through with them. I would very rarely, unless it was a very particular situation, hand it over. So I will always kind of keep in contact with the clients that I'm working with and update them on the research on a really ongoing basis, and start saying, you know, this is what we're finding, this is what we're figuring out, this is what we're seeing. Get their feedback as well on a constant basis, and kind of be saying, what do you think of that? Because I need to bounce it back off them. Because sometimes I will say to them, right, this is what we found out, and they'll say, oh, okay. Well, actually, the reason for that is X, Y, and Z. It brings up something else, some other piece of information from them that I hadn't gleaned before. And so they're sort of shaping everything as we're going along. I would never really do a whole piece of research on my own, away from everybody else, and then just hand it back to them at a later stage. It can't really work like that. I don't see it working like that, because they are as much part of it as I am, and as whoever I'm doing the research with is, because they're the ones who are going to have to deal with this and make it part of their decisions and start incorporating it. And I want to see that as I'm going along, because if they push back and say, no, we can't do that, I need to understand why really early on, because I don't want to be plowing ahead with a piece of research that they're going to reject, possibly for a really good reason, because there's something I haven't considered or I didn't understand. So it's a constant kind of back and forth process all the time. Does that cover what you're asking?
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks.
I know Gareth has a question there. What do you do with the research when you're finished? What teams do you give your research to, and how do you prepare and show your findings? It's not a stupid question. That's a really important question. I think what I said to Tasha there kind of answers it a little bit. Because I don't present the research when it's finished, basically just as a fait accompli. I do it as we're going along. So I suppose by the time we get to the end of the research, it's been a process, it's been a journey, maybe a rather exhausting one for some people. So we kind of have an understanding at that point, and we have a shared language, and we're all talking about the research and discussing it, and it's started to feed into the decision-making process already. So they might come back to me at that point and say, you know, and what about this and what about that? So I'll be getting a lot more kind of input and feedback and understanding as we're going along. So the research, I suppose, in the best of circumstances, because this is not always how it works out, but in the kind of when it works out really well, there's nothing to be done with it when I'm finished, in the sense that it's already kind of gotten a new life in the processes of the company. It exists separately, you know, it's already in there. So generally with the research, I will give the research to, or will work on the research with the particular team that's working on that project, but I don't give it to them. We work on it together, because that's the only way it really actually gets into that team, and it really kind of embeds itself in the team. If it's done too separately, then it just ends up being a thing over in the corner that nobody understands, and it's what do we even do with that kind of thing. You really have to avoid that with all your might, because it does tend to happen.
Yeah, I think it's a really big part of why we do design research now rather than user research necessarily, because it's not just about finding answers and handing them over. It's about finding out solutions that work in the context of the organization. So it's part of the process. There's no point in us saying users want it to be faster if you as an organization can't make it faster. So it's about developing that process and changing how the project is working rather than giving someone a document and handing it over.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we've seen user research where there's been research to say users want this and users want that. And users want a bigger house and better hair and a richer partner. You know, they can want what they want. It's all about how what users want interacts with what the company can actually deliver, and what is actually feasible for the company to deliver, what the company wants to deliver as a company, and how those two things fit together. So it's kind of it's a real sort of symbiotic process. It has to go back and forth, because you have to be shaping it as you go along. It's not just one big block of research where you just deliver lots of graphs and pie charts and then you've done your work. So it has to be that interactive process. I know Marge has a question there as well. How do you engage with stakeholders who are not bought into the research process? Yeah, that's a tough one. I do put my foot down quite heftily at the start of a project. If I feel like that engagement isn't there, I'm just going to move over, because I think my laptop is running out of power and I haven't plugged in. So sorry about this. I'm giving you a tour of my office. Anyway, so I do say quite strongly at the start of a project, if there is this element that, oh, these people are not going to engage, I'm quite clear about the fact that then it's not going to be a useful project. I'm going to move around here, sorry. Because if there are kind of key stakeholders who are not going to engage, then as far as I'm concerned, that's a team problem that is not for me to solve. So I suppose I have the benefit as an outside contractor that I can sort of walk away, because, or I can do what I can in that context, but I don't have to come up against that issue. And I think if there are stakeholders who are not engaged, then I think you're essentially, to use a term my mum uses a lot, you're on a hiding to nothing, because essentially that stakeholder is saying, I don't want information that's going to make this project better. I don't know how you tackle that really, because it's such a fundamental part of the project that you almost have to say, okay, well, good luck to you then. Is that any helpful in any way, really? I don't know.
Yeah, all you can really do is sell why they should be involved and the benefit of it. But after that, there's not a whole lot you can do.
Yeah, I mean, I will explain it as best I can. I will say that we have worked with clients where originally there was a very kind of not very engaged kind of group of people who were a bit like, yeah, we have to do research, but you know, we're not really that engaged, and we're not going to really be that keen on the process. And then oftentimes actually they will sort of become involved in the research process because they have to, and they've sort of given in. They'll be the people at the end of it who are like, oh, we need research for everything. This was fantastic. You know, can you do research for this and that and the other? And I actually have to say to them at that point, no, because it doesn't actually solve everything. It's just, it has its place. But I think it you know, a good way of converting people is to do it really well and show them the value of it. So we had a client when we first, a few years ago, who started off with us, and they were like, do this research because we have to. And they've come back to us every year with a new project because now they're just totally hooked on it. So I suppose that's one way to do it, is to convince them with results if you can. But I know that process of trying to convince people is really hard and very, very draining sometimes. I know Ash has a question. Are there tools or software that you find particularly useful for conducting remote research? I've always used telephone or Skype or GoTo or WebEx for remote interviews, and this works well, but I was wondering if you've used other software. No, I use GoToMeeting, which is this one that we're using. And I just record the interview and listen back to it at a later stage and write down notes. I'm quite kind of a Luddite on that front. I kind of do it really mechanically because I think the value is in the words of what people say, and you have to really listen to it. So it's a matter of just having that recorded whatever way that you can, and then going back over it to get the meaning from it. So it's that's how I do it. It's nothing very technological. And do you use your software for data lineage of findings in research? Tasha, could you just let me know what you mean by data lineage?
Yeah, so say that you found something early on in your research and somebody quotes it, probably you change the goal 3 times, and then someone quotes something that you found in one of the first goal findings, and you need to go back and actually re-reference that data.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I tend to work on it is that when we're doing the iterative process, I make sure that we've tied up all the loose ends at each iteration. So yes, we keep all of the data, and I write very complete reports and breakdowns and summaries. The amount of times I summarize things is very often, but actually it's important for me to do that as well, not just for the project. But so say if we are kind of redefining the goal of the project, I will go through all of the findings that we found in that piece of research that we've done, and I will close them all off, so to speak. So what do we want to do with this piece of research? What do we want to do with that? What this finding, that finding? So we've all kind of done our due diligence on it, so to speak, so that we know where all of that has ended up. If at a later stage someone then comes back to it, my question, I suppose, at that point will be, what's the relevance now, in the sense that we have already closed that off? Do you feel like there is new significance for some reason in this, this finding has now become more significant again, and you want to relook at it, which is fine. We draw that piece of information out again and re-examine it in the light of what we now know. Or is it that they're kind of harking back, which can happen? What about this? Even though we've already talked about it, then I'll have to do a bit of stakeholder management, I suppose, in that situation, and explain maybe why we've already accounted for that, and understand what the objection is. Because again, my role at this point often is kind of negotiator, clarifier, translator, because sometimes it can be lost in translation as to what's gone on in that process, and I have to be the one to keep track of. And it's for me, keeping track is about going back over, understanding, telling a story, summarizing. It's quite intensive in terms of the mental effort it takes, but it's worth doing. I hope that covers what you've asked.
Yeah, that covers it.
And Elsa has asked, for difficult stakeholders, in my experience, it becomes about managing their input and knowing whether they have the power to kill the project, risk management, but I would play to their ego and say how important their input is to try and get them engaged a bit more early on. Also finding who influences them and get them on board where possible. And that's working in-house. Yeah, I think working in-house is definitely a different situation to how we work, which is not in-house. Generally, we do work with the same clients on a repeated basis, but I think usually when we first work with people, we set the expectations. So we set the expectations that we will have quite a lot of autonomy, and we will expect a lot of engagement, and we won't really tolerate a lot of obstructiveness from stakeholders. And I do think in situations where there is obstructiveness, my sort of personal feeling is, why should I have to put up with that obstructiveness? I know that's not necessarily the most constructive way to think of it, but like, I'm not really there to explain to people why what I do is necessary. Either they get it or not. And if I will kind of help them through the process and be very supportive to them understanding, but if they're completely against it and they just won't engage, then I feel like there's probably another reason for that. There's probably something else that's stopping them. Maybe they feel like you're challenging their authority somehow, or you're making them look like they don't know what they're talking about, in which case, what can you do about that, really? That's kind of a bit of a bigger issue. It's sort of hard to tackle. Anyone else have any other questions or comments or any other information that they would like to have?
Well, I can jump in on the data lineage issue because I think it's something that's come up more so in some of my bigger ones. So I work more on larger sort of government projects where we have like masses of research data from different people. And we tend to use things like, I mean, Confluence is in vogue at the moment, which is sort of where you create almost bespoke intranet web pages. But I think the software itself is sort of not the point. The point is that you build up almost a hierarchy of knowledge. So you have your raw data tucked away somewhere, but it's going to be really faffy to go dig through it. And you make sure that you have the sort of the summary data, which Francis talked about, written very clearly so people know what the key findings are. So unless they really need to dig into the raw data, you can go back and look at the sort of higher level findings, and making sure that that sort of reporting and summarizing is done sort of as soon as possible after the research, so you have the record of this is what was important then. But you've also got to acknowledge the fact that research does go stale. If you did something 5 years ago, what's the chances that it's still relevant now? It's not always the case. It was relevant for the decisions that you made then, but it can be the case that you'll need to revisit it. And again, that's something you'll capture when you're doing that summarizing. Just thought I'd put in my 2 cents.
No, I think that's a good point. I think, I think what you said more clearly what I was trying to say, which is that there may be reams and reams of data that you've collected. Like we'll have hundreds of transcripts of interviews, for example, where there's all of the detail of everything people have said. But of course, what's important from those interviews is what was the meaning of it? What does that actually mean for your project? So once you've extracted the meaning, it's good to have those interviews or that data or that survey data in the background, but really what you want to know is what does this actually mean? What have you gotten from it? What are the decisions you've made? Where has the direction taken you? And that's a shorter piece of information. And I do find that sometimes that's what's missing is where do we, now we have all this information, what do we actually condense it into with a piece of meaning involved? And how does that feed back into the project? And that's where the value comes from it. That's the whole point of doing it in the first place, is to get that meaning and to get that influence on the project. So that's a really key part of it. I've left my phone on the other side. What time have we? I just want to keep track of the time.
Sorry, my mute button's not playing very well. Yeah, we've got 4 minutes left. 4 minutes to 12. Thanks, Elsa.
So yeah, last chance. If you have any questions, or you would, I mean, we can. I'm happy to stay on as well and have a more kind of informal discussion afterwards. If anyone wants to stay, please feel free. I'm just noticing Alyssa. Sorry, I didn't notice you earlier, Alyssa. Hello. I'm spotting people's names now that I don't have my screen up. So if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to ask them. Have you ever had to go back to the loose transcripts? I usually find once I have the learnings, is there more to it? You can speak as well, Elsa. Oh, bye, Jamie. Jamie's heading off. Thanks,
yeah,
Jamie.
sorry, I was typing and trying to find my phone at the same time, and I failed at both. Basically, I usually find once I've learnt something from the research, I really need to go back to those details. And but my concern is that I sort of get to a level where I feel like I'm making my own assumptions, or making I get to a point where I feel like I've got that knowledge now, so we're good. And is there a point where do you go back? Do you challenge that at all, or how do you stop those assumptions from growing internally, if that makes sense? Does that make sense?
That is a really good question. Yeah, a really, really good question, because I find that happens to me as well, where I think, oh yeah, this group of people, they don't even do this. They don't, or they don't even like this, or they don't engage with this. And I sometimes have to stop and think, why do I think that? Where did I get that from? And I think it's being really strict with yourself, actually. It's sort of applying your own principles to yourself, which is that I don't make a decision until I know I can prove that what I'm making that decision on actually has some evidence. And it's leaving a really good trail of evidence for yourself, where you know So I'm getting quite strict with myself, where I will draw out a conclusion from something only if I know I can. And then, you know, so I'm not, if I think that's the case, but I really don't know, I can't say for sure, then my response to that might be, right, well, I need to either fix this with further research, or I need to be very careful and state very clearly when I write this down for myself, for future Frances, that to remind her, actually, you've kind of made a leap here. So maybe it's necessary sometimes to make a leap, because sometimes you can't know everything, and a lot of the time you can't know everything. But you have to be clear with yourself that actually you have made that leap, and that you possibly need to go back and fill that gap. So it's leaving good notes for yourself, being aware of it, and indicating where you've made a leap, using lots of question marks if that's necessary, asking yourself questions. Okay, so we're about to finish up, but I'm happy to answer any other questions if anyone else has any more, or if anyone would like to kind of stick around and have a further discussion, just say that in the comments, and we'll stick around with those people. Otherwise, we might finish up, or if anyone has any final comments.
Worth just stopping the recording now, I'd say, and then if anyone does have anything else, they can pipe up or put their video cameras on or whatever.